Hello and welcome to this webinar. My name's Julian Grenier. I'm head teacher of Sheringham Nursery School and Children's Centre here in Newham. And the presentation which I'm going to share with you here on YouTube is based on my keynote at Newham's 2023 Early Years Conference with a little bit of added content that's based on some of the rich dialogue and discussion that we had over the 2 days. Much of the content of what I'm going to talk about comes from this new book, Putting the EYFS Curriculum into Practice, which has been written by a range of expert researchers, educationists, practitioners across Newham and from East London Research School, edited by myself and Caroline Vollens. So let's begin. When we think about curriculum, we need to think about context. We need to begin our thinking by focusing on the children and the families and the community that we're working with. We're going to need to think about some big issues like child poverty, the impact of COVID-19. We also need to think about something which researchers call the Matthew effect. Let's have a look at these issues. When we think about child poverty, during the first lockdown, Jason, who is our Director of Public Health here in Newham, sent this tweet about over 10,000 food and supply parcels, 3,000 emergency medical parcels were delivered in a 5-week period to Newham homes. And as a children's centre, we played a big part in delivering those parcels. What that leads me to reflect on is what an example that is of the fragility economically of many of our families in this community, that so soon into lockdown, we needed to distribute that emergency help. So we know that we have huge strengths in our community, but poverty and poor housing blight children's lives. And I'm going to talk about some of the positive things we can do in the early years to support children from disadvantaged backgrounds. But I'm not meaning to imply that early years education and childcare is a solution to these huge social problems. We need that bigger social change. I'm also going to talk about how many of the inequalities which were highlighted during the COVID pandemic were already present in many of our communities. But this webinar is about things we can do as early years educators now to support all of our children to have the best start in life. Let's have a look at the issue of gaps by the end of the early years foundation stage between different groups of children. So we know that the statistics which were shared from the 2022 reception cohort tell us that overall 65% of children achieved that good level of development, 65.2%. But when we look at the outcomes for children eligible for free school meals, we see that fewer than half of those children achieved a good level of development. Fewer than half. So how well you did by the end of the early years was very heavily associated with how well off your family is. If we look at different groups of children from different ethnic backgrounds, we also see similar inequalities, which most powerfully affect children from Gypsy, Roma, Irish traveller heritage. We can also see that, for example, Bangladeshi heritage children, Pakistani heritage children, Black Caribbean children, and others too, all didn't do as well as the average child in England. These inequalities are not new, although they look particularly stark now. If we go back, we can see that through the whole period of the previous EYFS, from 2012 to 2019, there was about a 4.6 month gap between children eligible for free school meals and all other children. 4.6 months is a pretty big gap when you're only 5 years old. It would be nice to imagine that because the children are only young by the end of the EYFS, during the rest of their schooling, that gap will begin to close. And for some children, it does. And it's very important that we don't get into a negative discourse that assumes that all children from disadvantaged backgrounds inevitably aren't going to do well in school. But the big picture, when we think about equality, is a poor picture in our country. So far from closing, on average, that gap doubles by the end of primary and doubles again by the end of secondary school. When we look at children with SEND, we see that they are between 10 to 15 months behind other children by the end of the EYFS. 10 to 15 months, a huge gap for children who are aged just 5 years old. The evidence tells us that once children fall behind, it's very hard for them to catch up. By the time we get to GCSE results day, that means that children who've been eligible for free school meals are half as likely to get those top grades, half as likely. And of course, life and education isn't all about GCSE grades, but we know that good grades at GCSE open doors, open opportunities for our young people. It's noteworthy and significant that those inequalities in the early years, on average, become worse as our children and young people move through school and have such a significant effect by the time it's GCSE year. So why might this be? So some researchers talk about what they call the Matthew effect, coming out of the Gospel according to St. Matthew and its famous quotation that to those that have, there shall be more. To those that have not, there shall be nothing at all. So let's think about those that have. Those children that by the end of the EYFS have got well-developed language. They can listen. They can tell us their thoughts and how they're feeling. They love books. They know and sing lots of songs and nursery rhymes. They can follow a teacher's instructions. They can make choices. They can try things that are difficult, and if they don't do well, they can bounce back and recover themselves despite the disappointments. Children with those good foundations, they do really well once reading, for example, is being taught in school. And we can see in that top line that those children with firm foundations improve in their reading at a very fast pace between the ages of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. What about the children who don't have those firm foundations? It's much harder for them to learn to read. We know, for example, that a child's vocabulary at 5 is strongly associated with how well they're going to learn to read. So those children without firm foundations find it much harder. Their progress is slower. The gap widens. Doubling by the end of primary, doubling again by the end of secondary. On top of all of the historic inequalities we've had in the English education system, we've now got the impact of COVID-19, where as early years frontline practitioners, we are seeing the impact on children's communication, their physical development, their emotional well-being every day with the children we're working with. And it's really tough out there. And if you're working with young children, I think all of us thank you from the bottom of our hearts for the incredible job you're doing in often very difficult circumstances with children and families. We know that as a result of COVID lockdowns, many children and families were left without support, They may not have seen a health visitor, for example, or they may have only had a brief development check using WhatsApp video call, for example. We know that COVID didn't affect everyone equally. Different families and different communities have been affected differently, and we need to bear that in mind all of the time. We're seeing children today who get ill more frequently than usual, probably because they weren't mixing and seeing other children for such significant periods of their early childhood, and they haven't developed that immunity from infection. We're meeting children all of the time who haven't been in contact with the health or education services and who've got unmet and undiagnosed needs. And often those children are really struggling, and often their parents have really suffered without support, unsure who will help them as they face significant challenges in parenting. But it's also important for us to remember that we're meeting lots of children who are struggling at the moment in the early years because they missed so many important early experiences. But they're doing really well with us. They're getting those experiences now. They're running and jumping and climbing and developing their fitness and skills. They're talking and listening and sharing books, sharing songs and rhymes. They're making friends. They're doing stuff with other children of their age. And they're doing really well. And it's important that we consider them as children who've missed experiences rather than as children who have longer term needs. We need to keep a watchful eye on this group of children, but many of them in the medium or longer term will be absolutely fine. Let's just think briefly about the differential impact of COVID-19. So we know from the research shared by the Mayor of London that in the capital city, people from different ethnic groups, for example, were much harder hit than some other people on average. Bangladeshi heritage men, for example, were 5 times more likely to die of COVID or COVID-related illnesses. Bangladeshi women, 4 times as likely. And that's leaving us in many of our communities working with families who've suffered multiple bereavements and much hardship. It also looks like children of different ages were affected differently by the pandemic. So in the Newham 2023 conference in January, delegates were telling us that their 2-year-olds seem to have been very significantly affected by COVID. Their 3 and 4-year-olds also seem to have been very significantly affected by COVID. Whereas the children who are in reception at the moment, although they were definitely impacted, doesn't seem to have been quite as significant as that younger group of children. And maybe when we look at their ages and we think about children being birth to 2 years old, experiencing 3 different lockdowns, those children who were born in lockdown and then experienced a further 2 lockdowns, those 2, 3, 4-year-olds, delegates told us, seem to have been very seriously affected by lockdowns, by the pandemic. So we have got through a lot of difficult times as practitioners in the early years. It hasn't been easy for the last few years, far from it. And yet now perhaps we're facing some of our biggest challenges with children who've been very seriously affected by the experiences they've had, and perhaps even more so by the experiences that they've missed. So that means the choices we make as practitioners are particularly significant at the moment. When we think about curriculum, we've got to make the right choices for all of our children. The stakes are high for young children at the moment. In this next section, I'm going to talk about intentional teaching. I'm going to talk about the curriculum choices we might make and why we might make them. and continue to ask the question, are we doing the best for every child? A big theme of the discussions at the conference was around curriculum in terms of mirrors and windows. So when I say mirrors, when a child comes into our setting, encounters the books that we've selected, the resources we've selected for our home corner, for our small world, the dolls that we've chosen, when that child looks at the posters or other display that's up on the wall, can they see themselves in our setting? Is our curriculum a mirror for the children that we're working with? But beyond being a mirror, it's also vital that the curriculum is like a window for our children, a window onto worlds that they don't know about yet, places they've never been, imaginative play they've never done before. All of those things that are rich and exciting, creative, engrossing, irresistible in the early years curriculum. All of those windows that we want to open for children so they can look out on worlds that they've never seen before. So the first metaphor I'd like to share with you is for us to think about our curriculum in terms of mirrors and windows for all of our children. The second thing it's really important for us to focus on when we think about curriculum is child development. Maybe as well that means challenging some of the assumptions that we can occasionally make about child development, which aren't backed up by the best research and evidence that we have. So should we let children develop naturally in an enabling environment? Should we focus on planning lots and lots of small steps all of the time for every child so that the teaching we provide is as effective as possible and builds their learning? Is it important for us to track children's development from one step to the next? Let's think about some of these important questions. So here's the London Underground, the tube map. Child development is not like a tube map. Children do not move from one stop to the next in an orderly way, especially in their early years. We need to think about the unique child that is part of the EYFS statutory framework on unique learning journeys. But we also have to hold in mind that in child development there is an overall direction and pace. So we can't say for any individual child that this development will happen at this time and be followed by that development at that time. The research doesn't support that view. On the other hand, we need to have that big picture of how children develop and learn so we can pick up which of our children is thriving as a result of the curriculum we're offering and which children are struggling to learn. And of course, if many children are struggling to learn, that will cause us to reflect on whether our curriculum is actually the right one for the children we're working with. So I want you to bear with me for a moment, and I want you to imagine that you're on a bus in central London. You're heading out to the countryside. And I might phone you at certain points on your journey and ask you to tell me what you see out of the window. And I might use that to make a judgment about where you are on your journey. So you might tell me that it's very built up at the moment, lots of cars and taxis, motorbikes and buses, not much green to see. And I'm going to assume that you're still in the heart of central London. And maybe I phone you a bit later and you describe this scene. And I might conclude from that you're out of London now, you're in the countryside. But in fact, this scene comes from the London borough of Camden, which is an inner London borough. This is Hampstead Heath. So I can't know where you are on your journey just from you reporting at one moment what you see out the window. And it's the same with young children. We've got an overall sense of where we're heading and what the timescales are, but we can't just look at children and make an instant judgment about their level of development. We can't observe something in a child's learning and then look at a drop-down menu or a next step from a tracker or a document that links learning to ages. It's more complicated than that. We also need to bear in mind that children's learning and development doesn't just unfold. So we stand back, we let them grow and develop, we track that. That's not how it works. We're really important to children's learning and development. The interactions we have with children, the conversations, the play, the resources. Child development is not like the hungry caterpillar, going in a simple way from one stage to the next. So, we need to think in a mixed way about children's learning and about our curriculum. Yes, we've got the overall pace and direction of child development, and some of child development is biologically driven. We don't expect to see a 2-month-old baby walking. But equally, lots of children's development is in response to the stimulation, the resources, the play, the time, the love, the attention, the conversation that we provide for them. Some of what will help children to learn and develop well, we can plan ahead for. Some of it is about what the American author Ann Epstein calls intentional teaching, which is where we respond to children's thinking and ideas minute by minute, linking to important early learning, giving children that new word, helping children to see something mathematically by describing shapes, talking about how big things are, counting things with children. And recently in the Times Educational Supplement, I referred to this mixed approach as a mongrel curriculum. A mongrel curriculum is sturdier and more effective than either of the purebred alternatives, either a completely child-led experience of early education or a completely programmed approach to early years, entirely based around teaching children in small steps from one level to the next. We need this mixed approach. And Anne Smith, the New Zealand researcher, talks about the errors that people make at either end of the spectrum in early years. So if we have a model of development which emphasizes the child's natural and spontaneous development from within, so our role is just to provide that enabling environment and the child will spontaneously learn and develop. That's been strongly critiqued by the research out there. But just as strongly critiqued is the view that children's development is entirely shaped through learning processes, through what we teach children. That's also been critiqued. Both ends of the spectrum are wrong. The best place to be is in the middle here. We also sometimes hear a sense of contradiction between teaching children and developing children as independent learners. But we don't need to be so binary about this. And Jerome Bruner, back in 1995, talks about the way that the adult can intend for children to develop their agency, develop their ability to make and carry out their choices through early childhood education. And he talks about adults treating the child as an agent and bent on teaching him to be more so. When you teach a child how to use scissors, for example, they're a more independent learner because they can cut things as and when they need to use a rather simplistic example. Teaching can help children become more independent as learners. And especially when we think about that next phase that's going to be so important for children when they learn to read. High quality teaching of early reading, children becoming fluent readers, supports them to so much more independence because you can learn so much, experience so much through reading. The binary approach to thinking about teaching on the one hand and children as independent learners on the other hand doesn't stand up once you think about it. The choices we make are really important for the children. In Development Matters, there are some very clear suggestions of the effective choices that we might make. Helping every child to develop their language is vital, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next section of this webinar. Depth in early learning is much more important than covering lots of things in a superficial way. So when you think, for example, of children learning number, it's much more important that we offer depth in that learning. We give children fun and repeated experiences so that they can practice counting and understand all of the complex things they have to do at the same time to count a group of 5 objects. We shouldn't be seeing a child count to 5 once, ticking that off, looking at our drop-down menu and moving on to a bigger number. Depth in early learning is much more important than covering lots of things in a superficial way. So when we're making those curriculum choices, we need to make sure that we give children plenty of time to achieve that depth in their early learning. So, as promised now, let's move on and think a bit about communication in the early years curriculum. The importance of language development. Let's think about something we hear a lot about, the 30 million word gap. Some of the challenges we face, and that focus on a broader and richer vocabulary that is important. So here's the challenge we face. When researchers spend time in preschool settings, what they notice is that the setting is dominated often by adult talk, which is very directive, doesn't respond to the children. So there's lots of talk which sounds like this. Can you come over here now? Can you put your coats on, please? It's tidy up time. It's time for snack. Can everyone sit here? That's directive talk, and it isn't responsive to children. The number of words we're using is restricted when we talk like that. If you're a child that is having rich and complex conversations in other parts of your life, that may not matter very much to you. But if you're a child who isn't having those richer early experiences, hasn't had them yet, and you depend on your early years setting, you are being really let down if that's all you're hearing. It won't give you the language model you need to develop your communication. There's an optimistic end to this piece of research, which is this. In contrast, where children do receive frequent examples of language models, development is enhanced. So we can make a difference when we have those rich back and forth conversations with children. But it comes back to choices again. We need to make the choice that that's a priority in our setting. We need to make time for it. We need to make sure we're not always rushing from one thing to the next, setting things up, tidying things up, directing children all of the time. Of course, we need those secure routines of the day, but there's got to be so much more than that, doesn't there, for children to do as well as possible. The choices we make are really important. Here at Sheringham, for example, because so many of our children are struggling with their communication as a result, we think, of their experiences during lockdowns, we've made the choice to implement a program called Talking Times, which is being evaluated at the moment by the Nuffield Foundation. And Talking Times means that all of our children, twice a week, have a small group time for conversation based around a book. That way we can be sure that every child has a minimum amount of rich conversational experience during their time with us. And you know what? When we look back on previous times, we're not sure that hand on heart, we can guarantee that we were offering that to every child every week. It's important. That's why we've made that choice. There is a lot of research that highlights the importance of high quality interactions between adults and children. Professor Iram Siraj and her colleagues state that there is an increasing recognition that the relationship a child has with a teacher or caregiver that is both sensitive and stimulating is the central and most critical component of early care and education. So what we've learnt about this, especially in the recent period, where we're working with lots of children who've had difficult experiences through lockdowns and COVID-19. What we've really focused on is the importance of thinking about children's emotional well-being together with the development of their communication. So when we get the key person approach right, children feel safe and settled and secure. They feel really loved and cared for and special. And in those conditions, children are likely to talk to the adults because they know that someone's interested in what they have to say and they're developing their confidence to speak. But that isn't enough, is it? The sensitivity is important, but so too is the stimulation. We're working with lots of children whose language development is significantly delayed. They need that adult stimulation. Adults are working really hard all of the time to tune into the children, to play with them, to get conversation going back and forth. And it's really difficult where children might have limited language, but crucial. And what we're finding is that we need the adults to catalyze that language development, which then in time leads to the children talking more with each other, playing more with each other, and all of that peer-to-peer language development. So let's have a think about that more. So everyday conversations and interactions are really powerful for the children that we're working with. All of those times when we're having snacks with children, eating lunch, helping them get dressed and undressed, the nappy changes, all of those can provide a rich context for a conversation. But we need to make that our priority. It's about the choices that we make. We need to make sure that we're not overloading our day with so many other things that there isn't time for that conversation. We need to think about the sort of vocabulary that we might bring into everyday situations like snack time. It's also important that we use books as a focus for conversation with children rather than always just reading to groups of children where the children are the audience. That back and forth conversation around a book, supported by the rich language and story and imagery in the book, is really powerful. And if you're interested to find out more about that, Sandra Mathers's chapter in Putting the EYFS curriculum into practice gives a really practical set of strategies to use based on the most robust evidence that we have. There are additional chapters in the book focused on English as an additional language and supporting children with SEND. So you can find out more. Let's have a look at how this practice plays out at Sheringham Nursery School through the EYFS video of what we are calling the Shrek approach to promoting children's early communication.
Oh, a sandwich. Oh, I love sandwiches. That smells good.
Yeah, because it got some orange to make it yummy and sweet.
It's got some orange peel inside to make it yummy and sweet. I can smell the peel of the orange. It smells delicious.
Yeah, but I like orange. I like orange banana.
Yeah, we can see the peel in the dough. You're rolling it with your hands to make a ball. Yeah, that's right. Yours is quite a small ball.
I'm just using a very big.
You can make it bigger, can't you? You could add some more dough and make it bigger. You can have a go with your pestle and mortar. Liam's Your cinnamon stick has broken into pieces.
We see how Rahima pays close attention to what Liam is interested in.
This one is already broken. Do you want to try another one, Liam? You're twisting the lid. And it's open.
Now, what's this?
What's this? Good question, Liam. Should we sniff?
He is fascinated by the pestle and mortar and what happens when he uses it to break up the cinnamon stick.
This is a spice, Liam, called cloves.
But it's not going to break either.
It's not going to break either.
She responds to Liam's excitement and comments on what has happened. She follows his lead, tuned into his interest in exploring what happens with the pestle and mortar.
I'm going to have a go, Liam.
That's not going to work.
Can you see how I'm going to crush it using the pestle? Crush.
Maybe we should try these always.
Yes, that's a good idea. Liam would like to try the orange peel with his chapati.
Nah.
Not for Leo. Oh, I might crush it first, Liam.
We will bite. We will forget to.
Oh, you can really smell the orange coming out of it now that I've pressed it.
So sweet.
So sweet. Liam likes the orange peel smell.
Yeah.
You like it?
Yeah. Nah.
Not for Leah.
It's the color orange.
It is the colour orange. And you noticed that we were having orange at the snack table and you could smell it.
By repeating what he says and adding more words, she expands his language. Rahima establishes a back and forth conversation with Liam. She makes sure that she gives him time to listen, process and reply, and uses open questions carefully to extend and sustain the interaction.
Oh, it's broken.
And look,
And it's ripped.
it's ripped. Look what you've got at the bottom of your...
Wow.
Can you see? All the orange oil has come out.
Yeah.
So I love watching that. Every single time I get something a little bit more out of seeing Rahima's really skillful work with our children here. And we hope that Shrek helps you to remember the key steps that you need to take as an adult to encourage and develop conversation with children. Now, you may have heard quite a bit about the 30 million word gap, the idea that when children from disadvantaged backgrounds start school, they've heard 30 million fewer words than children from more advantaged backgrounds. And it may have struck you when you heard that it was a bit of a hopeless finding. How could we possibly help children when they are at such a disadvantage as that? And in turn, that focus on the 30 million word gap led to a rather negative discourse about children from more disadvantaged backgrounds. It's crucial that when we focus on narrowing the gap, we don't get into that negative discourse, that we remember that all of our children come to us with huge strengths and potential and creativities. And it's our job to work with the strengths that the children bring, as well as to be pragmatic about helping them with the difficulties they may have. And interestingly, the whole theory of the 30 million word gap has been strongly challenged by more recent research. And in a moment, I'm going to share with you a video from Rachel Romeo and colleagues, where she puts forward a very different account of what matters. It's not just the number of words. It's not the number of words in a simplistic way that makes a difference. Instead, Romeo's findings focus on the huge significance of conversation with young children. And I think Rachel Romeo also reminds us that we need to think of the huge potential of all of our children, rather than starting to talk about some children in negative terms, as if we can never give them the help that they need. So here's Rachel Romeo and her colleagues talking about their research findings, which take us beyond the 30 million word gap.
Our laboratory is really interested in understanding how children's minds and brains grow and develop. The field has largely used this term, the 30 million word gap, and that comes out of research where researchers recorded home conversations between parents and children of various levels of family income and education. And they estimated or calculated that a child who arrives at the beginning of school, who comes from a high income, high education family, has heard 30 million more words spoken to him or her than a child who comes from a family where there's lesser education and lesser income.
So the question is why, and what do we do about it? We know that the language exposure is contributing to the children's language abilities, but what is the mechanism underlying this input-output relationship? How is the language exposure translating into a language gap?
And the second thing we were very interested in is, although we know that this word gap is associated with family income, how close is that relationship? So we had to go look for lots of parents with kids from a broad range and diverse backgrounds in terms of income and education at home, and ask them to wear a device at home so we could record the number of words that were spoken between parents and children, as well as the number of conversational turns.
We had a small fleet of audio recorders that children would actually wear in a shirt pocket, and they would wear these from the time they woke up to the time they went to bed at night, and then we would use speech recognition algorithms to determine how much speech they had been hearing and how much speech they had been producing themselves, and then how many back and forth turns they'd been taking with other conversational partners.
And then the children came in, and this was the exotic part of the study. They went into an MRI scanner, and we recorded their brains as they heard little stories that were spoken to them while their brains were being monitored through functional magnetic resonance imaging.
Neuroimaging was pretty labor intensive as well. Working with children as young as 4, it's very difficult to do MRI scans with them because they have to lie perfectly still so that we can get nice, clear images. So I'm sitting next to our mock scanner. It's a wooden replica of what the MRI scanner actually looks like. And if they move too much, the motion sensitive camera will cut off their video. So it's kind of a conditioned training for these children to teach themselves to lie still while they're doing the imaging session. After we finished collecting all of the data, we were excited to look at how the home language experience related to the brain functions. And what we were surprised to find is that the number of adult words didn't seem to matter at all for the brain function. What mattered was the number of conversational turns.
The part of the brain that showed the biggest difference in relation to conversational turns at home is one of the 2 major language areas of the brain. It's called Broca's area. And what we saw was that the more these children had conversational turns at home, the more this area was engaged as they heard stories spoken to them while we were imaging their brains. The second thing we were surprised by a little bit was that it didn't matter the education or income level of the family. What mattered was how often these conversations turned back and forth.
So we're taking these results as sort of a social optimism of sorts, because socioeconomic status, or SES, is largely difficult to change, but a conversation with your child is something much more simple, much more malleable.
So our next goal is to work on interventions that will help families have more of these conversations back and forth. Can we not only describe this relationship, but can we foster and enhance it so more parents are comfortable and supported in having these kinds of critical conversational turns with their children?
So, powerful presentation by Rachel Romeo and her colleagues of their groundbreaking research. And I think there are 2 key takeaways from this. Number 1 is we've always got to remember that research and evidence aren't fixed. New research will update, challenge, even overturn our assumptions. That's why, when we think about evidence-informed practice, we need to be critical and careful readers of the research. We need to check its robustness, its validity, and we need to be open to the ever-changing nature of findings. But that doesn't mean that we just kind of bend in the wind and we go from one extreme to another. We need some anchor points. And organizations like the Education Endowment Foundation, Stronger Practice Hubs, Chartered College of Teaching, help us to access that robust, high-quality evidence. That means we can put the best practice to work for our children, like the focus on conversation, rather than an excessive focus on the number of words that we speak in the day. And the second takeaway is a straightforward one: conversation. If you remember one thing from the seminar, please make that choice to give time in your provision to conversation with every single child regularly. There's one final really important point to emphasize. Okay, so let's summarize some of the important points of where we've got up to. Conversation is crucial. It has to be for every child, not just for the chatty and confident children, the children that want to play with us. for every child. And we've got to work really hard to make it a priority in our settings. Reading to children is great. It gives children that rich experience of vocabulary and story structures and the whole love and enjoyment of books, and it's really crucial. But even more powerful than reading to children is reading with children, using books as a focus for conversation. So it's important that we maximize time to share books with children and use that dialogic or conversational approach. The intervention talking time has a lot of detailed guidance for practitioners on this very topic. We've got to be honest when we answer the question, are we doing the best for every child? Are we helping every child to develop their communication? In the book that I've been talking about, Putting the EYFS Curriculum into Practice, you will see similar discussions to this one about communication, about all the other aspects of the curriculum, the 3 prime and the 4 specific areas. And those chapters, which are written by leading experts in the field, will help you to reflect on the choices you're making in your curriculum, in your provision. And the chapters are accessible, they're consistently set out, they're full of practical examples of high quality practice that's informed by the best research and evidence that's available. In addition to that focus on the areas of the EYFS curriculum, there are specific chapters on inclusion, English as an additional language, professional development, supporting disadvantaged children, and what we call vertical curriculum design, making sure that the EYFS gives all our children those sound foundations, making sure that Key Stage 1 builds on the important early learning that children have done in nursery and reception. Professional development is key. It's crucial that we make time to support the learning and development of all of our practitioners. And that again is explained in some detail in the book. Themes that weave through everything in the book are equalities and drawing on the best research and evidence. So let's move to the concluding section of this webinar. When we're thinking about curriculum, how can the Early Years Toolkit from the EF help us? Should we stop doing things which are good for our children? What does that phrase mean? Brains are built, not born. And how can you find out more? Let's start with the Early Years Toolkit. You can Google that. It's from the Education Endowment Foundation. The toolkit is an incredibly powerful tool for all of us to use. Because what the researchers who work with the EF have done is they have reviewed hundreds and hundreds of studies, and they found the most robust and reliable evidence that's out there. And they synthesized that to give us these big headlines about what the evidence tells us. So, for example, if you look at the toolkit, you'll see that according to the best evidence we have at the moment, if your built environment is satisfactory and safe and comfortable and adequate, you could spend a lot of money enhancing your built environment, but there isn't much evidence behind that as a priority. And the evidence we do have suggests that all that work and all that money you spend will have zero impact on the children's learning. If you look next on the toolkit at communication and language approaches, you'll see that these are relatively inexpensive to implement. So we already have staff in place who want to do the best for our children. So the cost of communication and language approaches is the professional development and the ongoing support of those staff to carry out the sorts of practices I've been talking about that we know are effective. There is a lot of evidence behind focusing on communication and language. So you'll see 4 padlocks there. And the impact, when implemented well, is 6 months additional progress. So if we go back to the beginning of this webinar and think about that 4.6 month gap between disadvantaged children and the rest that there has historically been in the EYFS, a 6 month boost to children's communication and language is significant, especially because we know that children's vocabulary, age 5, is strongly associated with success through the rest of their schooling. It's one of the most robust findings we have in education. So when we're making choices about our curriculum, the toolkit is a really good place to look. 12 approaches for improving teaching and learning. But the EF is not suggesting that this is the answer to the many complexities that we might face in our roles, because our professional experience, our knowledge of the children, families, communities, that's really significant too. It's that professional expertise plus research that produces what we call evidence-informed practice, which we think is the way forward to make a difference for all of our children in the early years, but especially those children who might otherwise face disadvantage. And that's why we're so excited by the Stronger Practice Hub programme and its focus on evidence-informed practice. So we're not just listening to the loudest voices, the most charismatic trainers and experts. We're listening to the evidence that has been patiently accumulated over many years, tells us what the best bets are if we want to make a difference for all of our children. It's important, I think, to remember this key message from Harvard Center for the Developing Child. Brains are built, not born. Brains are built through those rich conversations, through those well-planned learning environments, through those carefully thought through activities where practitioners have really considered what the learning potentially is and make sure that all of the children access that crucial learning. Brains are built, not born. I hope you've enjoyed the webinar. I certainly enjoyed sharing this with delegates at the Early Years Conference, and I learned a lot through the conversations that happened afterwards. And some of that learning is woven through this updated version that you've just seen and heard now. If you want to find out more, freely available online, you've got Development Matters, the DFE's non-statutory guidance that goes alongside the EYFS. You've got What to Expect in the Early Years Foundation Stage, a guide for families. That's a document that has been optimized for mobile phones and tablets so that we can share it with parents and carers and use it as a background for those conversations about the children's play and learning, both at home and with us in nursery settings and schools. Thirdly, we've got the guidance for the progress check at age 2. Lots of really helpful pointers there for working with parents, raising concerns about whether children might have additional needs, supporting the early home learning environment, for example. So that guidance on the progress check at age 2 is another really useful document. All 3 of those documents have been written in plain English so that they're accessible to parents and practitioners. And finally, of course, I'm pointing you to our new book, Putting the EYFS Curriculum into Practice, which I co-edited with Caroline Vollens. We hope that you find that a useful and practical book, guide to the best research, evidence and practice that we know about at the moment. Thank you very much for joining in with this webinar. Remember, you can connect with our research school, East London Research School, and our Stronger Practice Hub to carry on that learning journey together. Thank you for your time.